This is the video lecture for Lesson 23 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. This lesson is devoted to the subjunctive mood and the different forms of the subjunctive. To begin with a brief review of mood, remember that mood indicates how the action of the verb relate to reality, or how the subject views the action. You'll recall that we've learned the indicative, which is the mood of reality. In Greek, there is also the imperative, which is the mood of command, and the subjunctive, which is the mood of possibility, which is what we will learn in this lecture, and the optative, which is the mood of wish. Here is a brief overview of the subjunctive mood. The subjunctive is the mood of possibility or the mood of probability. In addition to possibility and probability, it can also convey doubt, expectation, volition, intention, desire, and other nuances. The subjunctive is characteristically oriented to the future. That is to say, it indicates some potential or possibility in the future time. In Greek, it occurs in the present, aorist, and perfect tenses, although it occurs so rarely in the perfect tense that our lecture in the textbook will focus only on the present and the aorist forms. In the subjunctive mood, tense denotes kind of action, not time of action. So a present tense verb in the subjunctive does not necessarily mean that it occurs in present tense time, nor does the aorist tense denote that something has happened in the past time. Rather, with all tenses of the subjunctive, there is usually some orientation to the future. The subjunctive mood is negated with me, not uk, as it is with the indicative. So, before looking at the different forms of the subjunctive, there are a few sort of general principles that will serve as an introduction. First of all, the chief characteristic of the subjunctive in all of its forms is that the variable vowel is lengthened. So an epsilon will become an eta, an omicron will become an omega, and so forth. We use the primary endings, or those endings that we first learned with the present tense, throughout, even in the aorist. The second aorist forms have the same endings as those first aorists in the subjunctive, but they are simply added to the second aorist stem. Then finally, the aorist active and middle retain the sigma, and the aorist passive retains the theta that we've seen in the indicative. But because these are not in the indicative mood, neither of them will have the augment. So all of this is to say that although the subjunctive may look different initially, there's a lot of commonalities among the different forms of the subjunctive and a lot of commonalities with other forms of the indicative. And so in the next several charts, as I introduce these forms, I'm first going to introduce the subjunctive endings and then compare those with the indicative endings to show you how much you already know, as long as you keep these general rules, especially the rule of lengthening, in mind with the subjunctive. All right, so in this slide, I am presenting the basic endings of the active voice in the subjunctive mood. And you can see with the blue font how there is this lengthening that occurs throughout with that connecting vowel. And in order to help you see that more clearly, I want to put this chart of the indicative endings for the active voice right next to it. And you can see that in the first person singular, there is no connecting vowel, so those are identical endings. But in all of the other forms, you can see how the connecting vowel has been lengthened, but the basic identifying marks of the person and number remain the same. And so I just point out that with the second singular, the original ace has become ace, and you can see that the iota has sort of snuck under the lengthened eta. And the same thing happens with the third singular. E becomes a with the iota subscript again. And so in all of these cases, as long as you're keeping in mind the rule of lengthening, it should be fairly easy for you to identify both the subjunctive mood and the person and number. And so just to present you with a few examples, for the present tense of the active voice of the subjunctive mood, you just take the stem and add the subjunctive ending. So you would take lu and then add ace to get luace, which is the present active subjunctive of the second singular. Very similar with the aorist. You take the stem, you add the sigma, which is the marker of the aorist tense, and then you add the ending, which is identical to the present ending. And so you would have luces, which is the aorist active subjunctive second singular. Now, very similarly, the endings of the middle or the middle passive voice demonstrate similar lengthening. Once again, I've used the blue font to indicate those areas of lengthening, and then the red font to indicate those personal endings that we've become very used to. And then just to present it sort of in comparison to the indicative, once again, it will show the lengthening of those connecting vowels. And as we saw with the active voice, there are some similarities between the subjunctive and the indicative. So, for example, the second singular is identical in both moods. And so only the context will tell you whether you have a subjunctive mood or an indicative mood. But other than that, the lengthening is fairly consistent, and then those personal endings are what we would expect in other moods. And so for the present, once again, it's the stem plus the ending. So lu plus etai is luetai, which would be the present middle subjunctive or present passive subjunctive third singular. And then for the aorist, again, it's the stem plus the sigma, which indicates the aorist plus the ending. And so you would have lu se etai. And so lucetai would be the aorist middle subjunctive third singular. And just to point out, as with other instances of the aorist, the middle and passive forms are distinct from one another. In the present tense, however, the middle and passive forms are identical in the aorist or in the subjunctive mood. And here is the aorist passive subjunctive. I've tried to point out, again, using the font colors, the different parts. So you'll see the stem, luth, throughout, and then the theta, which is the indicator of the aorist passive, and then these endings that we've seen in the other forms of the subjunctive, these lengthened endings. And so again, in the blue font, indicating the lengthening and the personal endings that have been added. And so you'll notice that there are active endings throughout, even though it's an aorist passive subjunctive. And throughout, it's the stem plus the theta plus those active endings. So all of that is to say that I don't think that you will need to memorize all of the charts introduced in this lesson. Rather, it will be important for you to know what are those key signs of each form of the subjunctive, and where do you see the lengthening, and what are the other markers of tense. So the theta for the aorist passive and the sigma for the aorist active and aorist middle. Finally, briefly, let's look at the present subjunctive of a me. And the thing that I want you to recognize about these forms is they're identical to the aorist passive forms of lua, which we just saw, except that we've dropped the luth, right? We've dropped the stem, lu, and the theta, but those endings are identical. And so, o, ace, a, omen, ete, osin. And so we see the use of the active endings throughout. I would recommend that you memorize these, that you would put them into your vocabulary list as we have with other forms of a me, because it is just good to sort of be practicing these forms so that you can recognize them as quickly as possible in actual Greek sentences. All right, so there are several uses of the subjunctive, and one way that we can divide them up is their use in independent clauses and their use in dependent clauses. So in independent clauses, when the subjunctive verb is the main verb, there are three basic uses. There is the hortatory subjunctive, which is when you use the first person plural form of the subjunctive. And these are exhortations that we would translate as, let us do something. So, for example, we might see a sentence, legomen pros ta tekna kai parakalomen auta. In this case, we would translate it something like, let us speak to the children and let us exhort them, or let us encourage them. And you can hear the let us. These are subjunctive forms of exhortations. The second use of the subjunctive with independent clauses is known as the deliberative subjunctive. These are essentially questions about a course of action, whether in direct or indirect discourse. And so an example of this would be, labomen artan apoton teknon hemon kai phagomen autan. And so we would translate this as, should we take bread from our children and eat it? The third use of the subjunctive in independent clauses is the emphatic negation. This is used to strongly assert that something will not happen, and it's signaled by ou me, which we would translate something like surely not or never. An example of this would be ou me epite kaka perites metras mu, which we would translate as, you all will never say bad things about my mother. Next, there are two uses of the subjunctive in dependent clauses. That is, when the subjunctive is a subordinate verb. It is completing the meaning of another verb or another part of the sentence. The most common use in this type are used to express purpose. And so these are typically going to be introduced with the word hina or hupos, and we usually use may or might in translation. So an example of this would be, anabainomen pros ta hieron, hina idomen tauta ta semea. And so we would translate this something like, we go up to the temple so that we might see these signs. Finally, the subjunctive is used in conditional clauses to express conditions in future time or general circumstances in the present. These will be marked by aeon, which just means if. So a general rule is that a, which is a word you've learned in the past, plus the indicative is used for simple conditions. Aeon plus the subjunctive is used for future or present general conditions. Now I just want to point out that the section 164.5 may be a bit confusing, and that's because conditional clauses are varied and complex in Greek. And this lecture and that section in the Croy textbook are meant to provide a basic orientation. But these are the sorts of things that might be covered in a Greek 2 class or even in an exegesis class. And so try to keep that general rule in mind, and as confusion arises, we'll deal with that together in class. So an example of a conditional clause would be, en hamartoloi krasosin to kurio ha kurias apakrinetai. And we would translate this as, if sinners cry out to the Lord answers. And so this is an example of a sort of a present general condition. We might even translate, whenever sinners cry out to the Lord answers to him. So it's the crying out to the Lord is this notion of a general present condition that is met with this present response of the Lord. Okay, so I want to get started with the first practice and review exercise. It has a few things that we can use to review what we've learned in the last several lectures. So, ha didaskalas tes dikasunes apelusan tus aclus, hina ap elthontes estas comas, agorasosin heautois artan. And so to begin with, we see the subjunctive that follows that hina, that word hina. So this would be a hina clause, a purpose clause. So hina agorasosin. And you'll see that I've pointed out the hina, which is one of those markers of the subjunctive, as well as the lengthening of that theme vowel or that connecting vowel. And then the sigma in brown font there indicates the aorist. And so we would parse this verb as aorist active subjunctive third person plural. You'll also see that we have a participle, which we've recently learned, ap elthontes. And so I've tried to break it down into its component parts. You'll see that ap is from the preposition apo, and eltha is from the second aorist root of erchomai, and then ontes is what we've become used to seeing with masculine plural nominative participles. So we would parse this as aorist active participle, masculine plural nominative. Now, with those basic review items in mind, we can move towards a translation, which would be something like, the teacher of righteousness dismissed the crowds so that after they departed into the villages, they might buy bread for themselves. And so there are a number of ways that we might translate that phrase ap elthontes estas comas. We could move that around to the beginning of the sentence as it is, or to the beginning of the clause as it is here, or we could even move it to the end. And we could use the word when instead of after. So we could say the teacher of righteousness dismissed the crowds so that when they had departed into the villages, they might buy food for themselves, or something like that. All right, this is the end of the lecture on Lesson 23. The subjunctive mood, though it seems perhaps odd at first, should be manageable for us, as long as we remember that the lengthening that occurs with the connecting vowel, and keep in mind those 5 different uses of the subjunctive. Thank you for your attention.